Today, I'm sorry in advance that we don't have speakers. Yes, please, everyone, turn off your phones. I'm sorry in advance we don't have speakers. That's because we actually asked the venue. They said that we're not allowed to have electronic speakers. So we asked for a podium as well. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it. But I think if we all remain relatively quiet, hello, please welcome. If we stay relatively quiet and respect each other's, when someone else's spot is talking, don't jump in the middle. I think we should be okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. So I'll just ask Mr. Jennings to speak a little bit louder too. Okay. So
I'll manage.
Yeah. Yeah. You're used to it. I mentioned it. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. I'd also take the time to thank Mr. Jennings, Garnett Jennings, for attending today. Despite being based in Alberta, I don't know if you had some business here, but we're very happy that you came all the way here. We know it's not easy. It's not necessarily on your way. So he took the time to come here today to discuss the motion that he introduced in the House of Commons earlier this year on Iran, and just generally some questions that individuals might have here regarding the Conservative Party, Mr. Jennings' own policies, and how that relates to Iranians. And we're going to stick to the Iranian issue and issues that specifically affect Iranian Canadians. And I'll give a little bit of a bio of Mr. Jennings now. So Mr. Jennings is he is a member of the Conservative Party of Canada. He's a member of Parliament, and he represents the riding of Sherwood Park Fort, Saskatchewan, in Alberta.
Yes. Yeah. Everyone thinks it's Saskatchewan.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah.
Fort North Saskatchewan River.
That's why I mentioned in Alberta.
Yeah.
So he won this riding in the federal election of 2015. At 31, he's one of the younger MPs in the House, I believe. He was also named Maclean's Parliamentarian of the Year by his fellow MPs. He is also the youngest recipient of this designation ever. I think the closest person was like 10 years older than me. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah. He's also currently the Deputy Critic or Deputy Shadow Minister of for Foreign Affairs in the House of Commons. So, in advance of this meeting, everyone I hope knows what this meeting about, what kind of caused this meeting was the motion that was passed. In advance of this meeting, we actually completed an online survey of our supporters. We asked our members whether they supported the Conservative motion on Iran and provided them the full text of the motion. Of the 928 respondents that we had, 875 or 94% of them responded that they did not support the motion, while around 6% stated that they did support it. Additionally, many of the respondents used the occasion to describe the problems that the lack of diplomatic and consular relations between Iran and Canada has created for them. These comments highlight various issues, including lack of access to consular services and also the importance of a diplomatic dialogue and diplomatic channel between the two countries. After this meeting, we'll provide a list of all the comments provided and the results of the survey to Mr. Jennings and email it to the members of Parliament. This is in addition to the official parliamentary e-petition that the ICC launched that asked formally the Canadian government to reestablish relations with Iran as a matter of utmost urgency. And this petition actually garnered 16,000 signatures from citizens and permanent residents in Canada, and most of those were from our community. As such, we thought it would be a good idea to have Mr. Jennings here today to kind of explain himself to our supporters and members of the Iranian Canadian community who might support diplomatic relations or might have views on this motion. So we're very glad that he came. So I'll just say a little bit. So when we told our supporters that Mr. Jennings had agreed to this meeting, many of them were surprised. It is no secret that a gulf has developed between large sections of the Iranian Canadian community and the Conservative Party in recent years, especially after the Harper government closed the Canadian embassy in Tehran and expelled Iranian diplomats from Ottawa in 2012. It is also no secret that the Iranian Canadian Congress has disagreed with much of the rhetoric and policies coming out of the Conservative Party in recent years, including, as we said, Mr. Jennings' motion itself. To remind you all, this was a motion which called on the Canadian government to abandon its stated promise of re-engaging diplomatically with Iran. It also included a few other caveats, most notably perhaps the condemning Iran for the killing of Palestinian protesters in Gaza by Israeli forces. So as many of you know, the ICC disagrees with both the spirit and the letter of this motion. We strongly believe that the Harper government's 2012 decision to close down the embassy was a mistake. This failed policy, from our point of view, created many troubles for our community and also prevented us from having as a country, from having a constructive and serious diplomatic dialogue with a major country in the Middle East. Furthermore, our position that this decision worsened the prospects of Iranian Canadians who may have been imprisoned or otherwise held in Iran, who could no longer rely on Canada to advocate on their behalf. And this is actually a view that was held by some former prisoners themselves. Indeed, Homo Hutfar, who I'm sure many of you know, she was the Concordia professor who was held in Iran in 2016, is on record as stating that if Canada had had an embassy in Iran, her release may have been secured more easily. And I'm quoting here, and that she stated that an embassy is, quote, an important factor for protecting dual nationals, unquote. However, as recent events have shown in the past couple of years, not speaking with those with whom you disagree can create dangerous divisions in modern democratic societies. Political echo chambers develop, views ossify, and demonization becomes common. Therefore, as much as this is an event geared towards the Iranian Canadian community and its concerns, it can also bridge some of the gaps that have emerged in our broader society, or at least begin to do so. To allow those who disagree with one another to talk and to help hopefully gain a healthy respect for one another. This event is also an opportunity for a member of parliament to meet with members of the larger Iranian Canadian community. I might be making some assumptions here, but I've done some research on your writing. So Mr. Dennis's writing. So Mr. Dennis represents the riding of Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan and Alberta. And from the data that we have from 2013, you might know better than me, but there's only about 100 Iranian Canadians in that riding. Indeed, we are aware that that many members of parliament do not have the opportunity to meet Iranian Canadians outside of those who directly lobby their offices in Ottawa. This may be why some MPs seem to echo views that seem marginal to the community, that might be held by a small minority, and still claim that it's Iranian Canadians that they've talked to, or perhaps they even represent, and perhaps why individuals like former Prime Minister Harper, along with the current Conservative House Leader Candice Bergen, attended the gathering of the Mujahideen Khalq, or MEK, a group that was considered a terrorist organization in Canada earlier this year. So before we get started, I asked all participants to follow a few ground rules. Firstly, I ask everyone treat our guests with respect and each other also with respect, despite any disagreements you may have. Mr. Dennis has taken time out of his schedule to meet with us, and we should acknowledge that many politicians on his side of the aisle would not agree to do so, and that he's showing a considerable amount of good faith by coming here today. Secondly, I ask that you keep your questions and comments to 1 minute so that everyone in the room gets a chance to speak. If you have any more questions or comments, you can wait for the second round, and hopefully we will have enough time for a second round. I will act as moderator of this event, offering clarification and asking follow-up questions as necessary. Additionally, and Bijan Ahmed mentioned this earlier, for those who were not in the room, audio and visual recordings are fine, but please keep them to myself and Mr. Dennis, because some individuals in the crowd do not want to be recorded. Finally, the structure of the rest of the event will be as follows. Mr. Dennis will give his statement, and then we will begin our question and comments and answer period. Thank you, and please welcome Mr. Dennis as he gives his statement.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up if that's okay. My voice doesn't work as well when I'm sitting down. Thank you for that introduction and for setting the stage a little bit with your perspective. I actually had the pleasure, one thing you didn't mention in my bio, I had the pleasure of working in the public opinion research business beforehand. So I look forward to seeing the results of the survey that you guys organized, and certainly I can recommend my former company if you're looking for scientific surveys or whatever. And I might be able to even arrange a discount for you. And I always love interacting with the Iranian community. I think the last time I had the opportunity in sort of a large-scale way was when I was here in January during the most active part of the protest movements. And I remember having the opportunity to speak to a room with 500 people or so at the time, addressing the issue of those protests at the time. So although I don't have a large proportion of Iranian Canadians in my riding, I always appreciate the opportunity to interact with the community, whether it's here or in Vancouver or in other parts of the country. Now, I will say as well that before coming here, when you guys started advertising the event, I had a few well-meaning friends call to warn me that the ICC and I might have some differences in terms of point of view. I knew that already, though, and I want you to know as well that I come here without a shred of reluctance. It's important that we have the courage to enter into dialogue with those whom we disagree, and I want to thank the ICC for facilitating this dialogue. And for those who are watching, I know there were some people who wanted to get in here and couldn't. And there were some other groups that said, we'd love to have you come speak to our group, and we have a different perspective. So for those watching, I'm very keen to accept other invitations to speak to other segments of the community. I know that the Iranian community is diverse in their perspectives, and as is, by the way, every community within Canada. So on to the substance of what I wanted to say. So at a broad level, I believe that the goal of Canadian foreign policy should be to advance our values and our interests, with a particular emphasis on our values. And our values ought to be recognized as universal human values, those expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are Canadian, but also universal human values. Now, it's well known that universal human rights are violated in grotesque fashion inside Iran by the current Iranian government. And these rights violations are neither accidental, nor are they simply policy choices. They are part of the essential structure of the current Iranian political system. I don't really see a need in my opening remarks to catalog those abuses. I think they are well known to those here, but we can get to them in the Q&A if it makes sense to do so. What is important, I think, is that we understand that the nature of the politics of the so-called Islamic Republic, its nature is to elevate a guardian class over the people, to deny the people the liberty to question or challenge that guardian class. It's to allow the guardian class to control all aspects of the public and private lives of the people, to deny any civil society an opportunity to exist which opposes or questions this ruling cabal, and finally, to refuse to respect traditional structures of national sovereignty and rule of law, to subordinate these things to the goals of the revolution as determined by the self-styled guardians of it. This is the political system as it exists. The relative power of so-called regime moderates and so-called regime hardliners does not change, from my perspective, what is the essential logic of the system, or certainly which is the power of the supreme leader. Real progress is not possible unless and until the system is replaced with another. As long as that system exists, rights violations will be endemic and persistent. And I want to say as well that I firmly regard this political system as alien to the ancient and beautiful Persian culture and politics. The politics of the so-called Islamic Republic is foreign to and repressive of the Iranian people. Now, of course, no one can propose that there are not also other nations which violate fundamental human rights, in certain respects, even to a greater degree. We ought to highlight violations in these cases as well, and certainly in the Conservative Party, we do that. We do that across the board. But pointing fingers at other people only gets you so far. The fact is that violations of fundamental human rights are endemic to the political system in Iran. This is not, in my judgment, a particularly contestable point. So given that reality, what should our goal be in our relations with Iran? In my view, recognition of the state of human rights in Iran and a commitment to those same rights should lead us to desire and to seek systematic change in Iran. Change which reflects the legitimate aspirations of the Iranian people and of all people. We should desire for the people of Iran the same things that we enjoy ourselves and that we desire to pass on to our children. Freedom, democracy, human rights, the rule of law, opportunity, and prosperity. The people of Iran, as has been made clear in spontaneous protests across the country, desire these things. Their children deserve freedom no less than yours or mine. So I think we ought to work with that end in mind. We ought to work to support the advance of freedom for the over 80 million people in Iran who do not presently enjoy it. Now, we spoke a bit about polls. I don't know if this fits in the format, but I'd love to just pose a question and get a sense of people's feelings in the room so that I can kind of understand as we go through it. So if it's okay, by a show of hands, who here agrees with me that supporting the development of a new political system in Iran, which respects the fundamental rights of its people, should at least be a primary goal in our interactions with Iran? Who agrees with me that that should be a primary goal in our interactions with Iran? Okay.
Yeah, maybe we'll leave the.
Okay.
Because it'll get complicated.
Okay.
Don't leave the question. Clarify the question.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So my question is, who agrees that supporting the development through non-violent means of a new political system in Iran, which respects the fundamental rights of its people, should be at least a primary goal of our interactions with Iran.
Yeah, I think there needs to be some clarifications here. So
yeah, we don't have to do the
good stuff.
Yeah, okay. We'll leave that. But it's just interesting for me to get a sense of, some people agree with that, some people don't. But having said that, anyways, having said what I think the goal should be, let's talk then about how we get there. Now, it seems to me that very often the Western discussion of democracy promotion has been deeply marred by the troubled efforts of the United States and its allies to bring democracy to Iraq 15 years ago. Democracy promotion, because of that experience, came to be associated in many people's minds with violence and with failure. But that experience should not lead us to forget the experience of most of Eastern and Central Europe, Taiwan, South Korea, South Africa, and many other countries which made the transition to freedom and democracy for the people without violent intervention by another state, but rather with the application of a strategic mix of other democracy promotion tools along with strong action by their own people. Most of the countries that are democracies today were not democracies 100 years ago. And in the wide sea of possible cases, Iraq is the only example that I can think of where a war was launched specifically for the purpose of democracy promotion. So Iraq is very much the anomaly. So let's dispose of the idea that democracy promotion entails violence. We can successfully promote political change in Iran that reflects fundamental human rights. That change can be, in a sense, revolutionary, insofar as it involves replacing the old system with a completely new system, while also being very much nonviolent. So then, what are the tools we should be using as part of this effort to promote freedom and democracy? Should we favor disengagement, engagement, sanctions relief, public advocacy, private comments, support for civil society? What are the tools that will allow us to get to that result? Now, personally, I do not think that there is one universal way to pursue the advancement of human rights in every case. The right mix of different approaches at the right time is more likely to bear fruit than a one-size-fits-all. Being effective requires finding a strategy that meets the situation. But I think we've seen enough of history to know that what I would broadly call the appeasement approach is virtually never successful. So what is appeasement? Appeasement is when we give something in exchange for nothing. When we look the other way in the face of grossly unacceptable actions, when we reward bad behavior. Appeasement is giving into a bully in hopes that they will be less of a bully. That never works, because giving into a bully proves to him that his approach is working, and it leads him to double down instead of changing. But what can we do in the particular case of Iran then to advance freedom and democracy? We have some recent experience, of course, trying to come to terms with the regime. In response to commitments with respect to suspending aspects of its nuclear program, Iran did enjoy significant sanctions relief. And this arrangement, JCPOA, was no doubt rooted in good intentions. The sanctions relief it brought could have made a meaningful difference in the lives and well-being of the Iranian people. It could have been an opportunity for the regime to pursue further détente with both the West and with other countries in the region, and to open new trade and cooperation opportunities with past foes. But all of us here know that the regime did not use sanctions relief as an opportunity to invest in the well-being of its people. It did precisely the opposite. It used its increased strength to expand its support for violence and terror throughout the region and around the world. JCPOA critics were surprised by how the regime responded to sanctions relief. Were not surprised by how the regime responded to sanctions relief despite the good intentions of the deal's proponents. Because the regime is what it is, and sanctions relief did not change its nature. Sanctions relief, which delivers more resources to the government of Iran, will not make its way to those people who need the support the most. We know this both by logic and by history in general and in particular. So until we see change, we cannot let the pressure up. To do so will simply provide the regime more opportunity and power with which to suppress its people further and to further spread violence. Such release of pressure would also be read abroad as a sign of weakness. Weakness in our resolve, weakness in our commitment to our values. We want to associate improvements in relations with concrete, significant, and durable improvements in the behavior of the regime. But the regime wants us to give concessions in exchange for nothing. And they seek this by supporting agents around the world, financially and otherwise, to to advance their values and priorities in Western countries. These agents claim to speak on behalf of the Iranian diaspora. However, we know that the Iranian diaspora is overwhelmingly opposed to appeasement because they understand the DNA of this regime. Many of them, of course, emigrated precisely to get away from it. Now that said, recognizing that we cannot and must not give something for nothing, we want to be as targeted as possible in the mechanisms of pressure that we propose, so as to target the regime and its enablers, not the people. No sanctions regime will be perfect in this respect, but emerging tools are facilitating more and more targeted approaches. Conservatives put forward and successfully passed, for example, something called Magnitsky sanctions. Magnitsky sanctions are about targeting individuals who are human rights abusers. It's about sanctioning individuals. So if people in this room have feedback about how we can smarten sanctions, about who specifically should be targeted, and how, I look forward to hearing, and we can certainly research and explore those proposals. As part of our motion with respect to Canada-Iran relations, a motion that we've discussed that I proposed that received the unanimous support of all present Liberals and Conservatives, the NDP opposed it. This motion called for the sanctioning of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, for their listing as a terrorist entity under the Criminal Code. In response to that motion, we have been led to believe the Liberals are indeed beginning a process towards formally listing. Now, listing the IRGC is the right sanction for Canada to impose. It targets specifically the agent of active repression and violence. We hope other countries will join us in isolating the IRGC and standing by the Iranian people. We hope that the ICC will consider supporting targeted sanctions against the IRGC as well. Weakening the economic power and capacity of the IRGC will increase the relative capacity of other actors in Iranian society to push for change. It will send a clear signal to the regime of our commitment to promoting justice and human rights. Now, this particular motion was long and it dealt with a range of different issues related to Iran. I know that for some of you here, the question of a Canadian embassy in Iran is of particular importance. So as to that, I will now turn. In the last election, Liberals and New Democrats supported reopening a Canadian embassy in Tehran under the current regime. Today, in light of the motion today and the support it received from the Liberals, it seems that it's only the New Democrats who supported that reopening proposal. But in any event, from my perspective, there are many reasons not to reopen the embassy. One of them, of course, relates to the foregoing analysis, to the fact that giving something for nothing by seeking to restore diplomatic relations would send a very dangerous message to a regime that has never before seen re-engagement as anything other than an opportunity for increased aggression. There is also the question of activities which would be pursued by an Iranian embassy here in Canada, activities potentially aimed at intimidating the diaspora. But there is one particular aspect of the embassy discussion that I have yet to hear a response to, and that is the question specifically of the safety of diplomatic property and personnel. We know that the Iranian regime has a long history of attacking diplomatic properties and personnel. So for those who disagree, I mean, there's instances, the US, Pakistan, the UK, Saudi Arabia, some very recent. So should we have an embassy in a country if we cannot guarantee the safety of those diplomats? I posed this question during debate in the House of Commons. I asked my friend from the NDP, Cheryl Hardcastle, I asked her this: would she support closing our embassy in a country if the government of Canada could not ensure or guarantee the safety of diplomatic staff? Now here's what she said. She said, this issue is not black and white. If a government needs to close an office for safety, of course it can. It can also reopen it. What is the time frame? I do not know. Is that part of the debate here? That is also hypothetical. We need diplomatic efforts to engage. I'm not against engaging in diplomatic efforts, and I'm not against keeping people safe. To simplify the argument such that we have an us and them mentality instead of actually creating consensus on how we can address in the international community the horrendous ongoing human rights abuses is really quite disappointing and frustrating for someone like me who understands the limited time we have in this place for debate about international human rights, end of quote. And Ms. Hardcastle, although not entirely clear, perhaps, seems to acknowledge what has been precisely our point, which is that the government has an obligation to keep diplomatic personnel safe, but also that there are alternative ways that we can do diplomacy, and in particular, provide diplomatic service to Iranian Canadians through things like special interest sections, through back channels, through partnerships with other embassies. If the goal is freedom for Iran, then I do not believe that giving the Iranian regime something for nothing is going to help the Iranian people. I do not believe that sanctions relief will get to the Iranian people, as we've seen. But I also recognize that diplomatic tension and pressure has a cost. It would be foolish to suppose that diplomatic pressure does not entail a cost for certain individuals. Even if they are very targeted, sanctions would limit, for example, the ability of people here to do business with IRGC-owned entities. Anytime we impose sanctions, there is a cost. And at this point, we must ask ourselves then what our objectives are. What price are we willing to pay for someone else's freedom? If there are concerted tools and pressures to provide the means for necessary political change in Iran, wouldn't we all agree that it was worth it? Or is the pursuit of business with a sanctioned entity more important than the freedom of the people? While pressure on Iran has a cost, the alternative path has a cost as well. If we fail to recognize the risk that Iran poses and allow the normalization of its violence and oppression, then we will all pay for the associated loss of security. You and I as Canadians will pay, and the people of Iran will pay much more. So let us work with that clear end in mind. The rapid end of violent oppression, the restoration of an Iranian politics that reflects the rights and aspirations of Iran's people and respects Iran's best traditions. Let us look to the kind of a relationship that we will have with a free Iran. And when that day comes, when the people of Iran of all faiths and political perspectives can openly debate their ideas, when activists are no longer shot in prison, when women are free to dress how they wish, on that day, we will have a Canadian embassy in Iran. And when a free Iran is a leader in the region promoting human rights instead of promoting human misery, on that day, certainly, we will have an embassy. In general, perhaps we can pause then the question of relations with the current regime for just a moment and think about the kind of relationship we will have with the next government of Iran. When the people succeed in their pursuit of political change, when they succeed in creating a new government reflective of Iran's history and values, then how will that government view Canada, and how will they view the positions of the ICC? Will they thank us for being there for the people in their time of need, or will they criticize us for prioritizing our relationship with their oppressors? That is the question that we have to answer in Parliament, and you know, I think, what my answer to that question is. And with that, your question.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have a lot of people that have a lot to say about that, people that have lived in Iran and that know the effect of policies such as sanctions and diplomatic isolation now. Okay, so I'll go. Mr. Buluchi is the first one I see, and then we have Ms. Emobi, and then I'll go.
I just wanted to thank you for coming here. I know that it was very hard to come to an area that you don't have a love affair with the people here. I understand that you understand the dialogue. To start a dialogue with people. But when it comes to dialogue with the regime that you don't like, we don't like, nobody likes it, you put a stop on it. And funny thing is that exactly the same time you sell $15 billion military equipment to another country that is competing with the same regime in the area, killing people in Yemen, in Syria, in Bahrain, in Qatar, the same ideology is killing people in North of Africa, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and they just started deporting your politicians from their country, and they are taking their students out of this country. You are in love affair with them because they have money, and then I want to know why you have removed a terrorist organization from your blacklist here, and then you send your politicians to their convention in Tirana.
So I'm gonna repeat the questions, and then also for your clarity, and also for the Facebook Live. So I believe the question was, one, I believe was a reference to Saudi Arabia. The idea is that we as Canada do billions of years of business, billions of dollars of business with a country like Saudi Arabia, who I'm sure maybe you might agree has worse human rights record and also foreign intervention records than Iran does, and also exports Wahhabi, maybe terrorist ideologies that have been directly shown as causing some of the terrorism and other issues that you might think that Iran is engaged with, in the West specifically. And then secondly, I believe and then so the idea is there a double standard here? What are we doing? And specifically answering what it was. I believe it was the Harper government that started the LAV deal. So I think that might be what he's referencing. And then secondly was the idea of the organization that he's referencing, that he's asking why did your government, so the previous Harper government, but you weren't involved at that point. But still,
MBK, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know what their name is today. They changed their name already.
Yeah.
But one more thing.
Yeah, sorry, we have to wrap it up. Sorry, I mean, because he only has a lot of questions.
But he mentioned Iraq. That was the only failed.
Fair enough. I'll mention that.
There were lots of them.
Sure. So there's Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. There's lots of countries now. I think that's correct. So I think the two questions, let's divide them up. Let's just answer the first two. So the question was, one, the double standard question with Saudi Arabia and Wahhabi ideology, etc. And two, the idea of why did your government or why did your party delist the Mujahideen Khalid, the MEK, from the terrorist blacklist. I think that was.
And attended the convention.
And also, the previous prime minister, and also your house leader attended the convention, which is what I mentioned before.
Yeah. So, all right. Lots of questions here. So I know it wasn't repeated, but the gentleman, if I heard right, started his preamble by saying, thanking me for coming in light of it being difficult. It wasn't difficult to get here. I mean, the traffic was not great, but otherwise, I'm very happy to be here and yeah, with no reservations in being with you. And I know people here are sincere in their people are standing up to look. So maybe I'll stand up so you can see me then. Okay, so just on the questions of Saudi Arabia, right? I don't want to at all ever buy into a false choice between, it's either, we either have to be on the side of the Saudi government or we have to be on the side of the Iranian government. That is an impossible false choice. There are horrendous abuses of human rights on both counts. And I, at least as a member of parliament, have been pointedly, repeatedly critical of the Saudi government. Recently, the Saudi government took a position as a member of the Status of Women Commission at the United Nations. And I posted the video on my Facebook recently. You all should follow me on Facebook. But if you do, you'll find I reposted a video where I repeatedly challenged our foreign minister to acknowledge the absurdity of this situation. And she refused to. She refused to say that it's a bad thing that Saudi Arabia is on the UN Women's Rights Commission. So you'll get no quarrel from me in your criticisms of Saudi's domestic human rights record, the particulars of how they're conducting the war in Yemen, and various other things. The complete absence of any kind of religious liberty. I mean, it's not a race to be the least worst, though. I'd say for one thing. I'd also say this. I mean, as I said in my introductory remarks, I think we shouldn't apply a one-size-fits-all strategy to how we respond to human rights abuses in different countries. Sometimes we make an assessment of what the alternative would be to a particular regime. Sometimes we have to make an assessment of who are the different actors within a society and what are the tensions that exist between those actors. In Saudi Arabia, for example, tensions between the religious establishment and the royal family, a distinction that obviously doesn't exist in the case of Iran. And I'm not saying that any particular government always got that balance right. I mean, certainly in plenty of cases in hindsight, you say, well, maybe we were trying to do good in that case, but we didn't succeed there. But look, again, in the case of Saudi Arabia, Iran, it's not an either or. But I'm happy to defend our policy with respect to Iran because I think it is right. I think it is effective. I think recognizing that pressure on the government at this point in time can create the conditions for real political change that is realistic and positive in the case of Iran. I think that makes the policy eminently defensible. Look, I wasn't at the event in Paris. I'm going to have to relatively punt on that question. I assume that the MEK was removed from the terrorist list as the result of an assessment by our security agencies. I don't have the particulars of that security assessment in front of me. I will say just because somebody's not on the terrorist list doesn't mean we like them. But in terms of all of the nitty-gritty of what the security assessment was, I'm sorry, I don't have the particulars of that information in front of me. And then just finally this point, I just want to be clear about what I was saying about Iraq and democracy promotion. So my comment was that Iraq was one of, I think probably arguably the only case in which sort of the exclusive rationale for intervention was democracy promotion. I mean, in Libya and Afghanistan, there were other things going on. I mean,
was the main.
Right.
But that was the main.
Well, yeah. I mean, there were different justifications. So, okay, I mean, we might quibble on that point, and I think that in the scheme of things, it's a relatively small point, because the argument that I was making is simply this, that there are, yes, some anomalous cases where democracy promotion was associated with violence. But in the vast majority of cases where democracy promotion has been done, and done successfully, it was not done through violent invasion. Most of the countries that are democracies today were not 100 years ago, and most of them were not invaded for the purpose of imposing democracy. So it was simply to make the specific point that a commitment to democracy promotion and bringing about political change in Iran does not mean the idea or even the hypothesis of violent intervention. It is the idea that we can create pressure and support the people, create the conditions in which political change can happen. Thanks for your question.
So I'm going to ask a clarifying question just quickly. So
sure, yeah.
Would you support the breaking of diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia and the imposition of sanctions on certain individuals that are tied to terrorism or whatever? I'm not trying to make a personal point here, because I think that was what Mr. Gould was really getting at. So I mean, can I get a yes or no question? Would you support that?
Yeah. So you asked two questions. I would always support the imposition of Magnitsky type sanctions
on Saudi Arabia
against individuals who have been promoting terrorism. And
even if they're part of the Saudi royal family,
the individuals who are promoting terrorism, whoever they are, wherever they are, if an individual is involved in promoting terrorism, but that is. But I do not support. Well, I mean, it's sort of a moot point now, because we're on the verge of not having diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. But I would not have supported us taking the step of cutting off diplomatic relations, because I don't think, in the particular case of Saudi Arabia, that would have been an effective way of advancing human rights.
But I mean, that might not be a satisfactory answer for our audience, but I take that.
Yeah.
I said I was going to put Ms. Amami first, and then this individual in the best. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to go, because it's just easier for me to go this way. So go ahead.
So hi, and thank you very much for the time. First of all, I basically disagree with most of the things that you just said. And people like me are not really, well, there are many of us. I mean, I was wondering if you're familiar with the two petitions that are submitted on the Parliament's website, on the Congress's website. Are you familiar about the talks between Iran and Canada?
So I did mention the petition. You mentioned the petition
There
that
are two of them.
there's 16,000 signatures. I did mention that.
There is another one too. There is another one with 500, 600 almost. And once you're talking about different voices within the Iranian community, it's really hard for me to understand how does the Congress want us to show that like one of these voices is like supported by many more people, one of them is not. So first question is that, and secondly, I mean, I understand that you're critical personally about people that commit, human rights abuses anywhere in the world. Well, I was wondering if you have your motion ready to submit on the Congress to stop the talks between Canada and Saudi Arabia, because we're not talking about selling weapons to Iran. We are not talking about, even that motion is not about starting embassy or anything. It's about talking. Like, do you have your motion ready? Since you're so worried about human rights and you're so.
So let me clarify again. Let me repeat and clarify the first question. So what she's referencing is there were two petitions that happened. One was a petition initiated by the CC, and another petition was initiated by some people opposing that petition. So it was a counter petition. So our petition gathered 16,000. I think it's around 15,700 and something signatures. Whereas the opposing petition that was, I believe, sponsored by Ms. Samir Mohyeddin, that petition garnered, I want to say, less than 1,000, 600 signatures. So what Ms. Amami is asking is, you speak about different views within the community, and she's saying, well, I believe what she's saying is that to say that it's equivalent or it's half and half is not true. Really looking at maybe like 20 to 1, something like this. I think that's what she's referencing. Do you understand my saying?
So yeah.
So and the second one, I believe it was more or less the same question I asked him, but it's more specific.
Do you have your motion ready, or is it like when are we going to see a motion to act?
Fair. Well, I mean, I think maybe you stick to the first one because it kind of okay. So
well, I mean, I'll just do the second one first very briefly, and then I'll address the first. I mean, I think the Saudi question, I've answered it. I think there are, I think, and you may not be satisfied with the answer, you know, and you can vote for somebody else. But on the issue of Saudi Arabia, again, you'll get absolutely no defense of Saudi Arabia's human rights record from me. I have been vocal on that point repeatedly, but I do think that different cases call for different approaches. Now, I think that we need to look at the particulars of the situation and say what kinds of actions will make a difference. I also, by the way, do not think the physical safety of our diplomats is in danger in Riyadh, and I think that's a very different situation.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in here. Sorry, I'm going to jump. Everybody, please, let's give Mr. Dennis some time to speak. But I will jump in here real quick because I was actually involved at the beginning of this, and I spoke to certain individuals in the government at this time. The Harper government could not actually prove satisfactorily that the diplomats were in danger, as far as I understand. So at the time, that was my understanding. That was what I heard from Paul Dewar, who was the foreign affairs critical community at the time. So if you have different information about the here, I understand that it was done in the context of the British Embassy, but they could not verifiably prove that Canadian diplomats were in danger. But that's But sorry, go on. You're saying.
I have a huge amount of respect for Paul. He's a smart guy. He has a different perspective than I do. Clearly, his assessment of the risks were different. But look, when you have your diplomats in a country where there is a pattern of behavior by the local government, which is to use diplomatic properties and personnel as targets and pawns to try and put political pressure on the other country, I think that's something we should take pretty seriously. And if I was being posted as a diplomat in one of those countries, I would want us to take that pretty seriously too.
But again, to be fair, to clarify, it wasn't, from what I understand at least, it wasn't the actual government that did this. I think they might have been trying to stop it at some point or something. It was some individuals within. But you can make arguments that maybe why they didn't stop it enough. Well, I understand, but just again clarification. But go ahead. If you can answer the petition question, sorry.
I'm very happy to answer the petition question. I do think it's a bit of a stretch to say that in response to the particular political objectives, which were clearly the objectives of the regime, there were spontaneous popular protests against foreign embassies. Whenever we've seen spontaneous popular protests in Iran, it's been against the Iranian regime. Look, on the issue of how we demonstrate opinion, we're in a relatively small room tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to dialogue with you. I know there were folks from other perspectives who were not able to get in tonight, and you've got limited capacity in this room. I've spoken at events, as I mentioned, I've spoken at events with over 500 people, at an event with over 500 people here that were all very much on the other side of the conversation. So look, I don't want to say that your perspective isn't your perspective or it's not reflective of your experience. Of course, your perspective is you're reflective of your experience, but I'm not really going to take as a necessary aggregation of the community sort of one assertion of dueling petitions or a survey that was conducted by an organization of its members, which itself has a particular perspective. I half jokingly, but perhaps more seriously, say that there are scientific survey techniques available, and if the ICC wants to work with a petition company and there are polling companies. I was involved in projects like this where we would actually seek to poll people from particular communities to understand their perspectives, and you can do this in a scientific way where you're randomly testing. So if people want that, I have to say from what I've seen,
that's fair enough. And thank you. And I'm going to start moving it along. Genuinely, we would love if you could actually allow us. We would love to do a scientific survey.
Great.
We would love to do that. So,
I'm not going to pay for it, but
we'll figure it. Just get us a discount. Okay. Sorry, we have the individual in the green vest. Yeah.
Thank you for being with us today. As I understand correctly, you mentioned there are some other ways to provide consular services for Iranian and Canadians. What can be that services, and are you ready to support this idea officially or not?
Yeah, so the idea would be that you have a special interest section. So you have a section at embassy that would provide diplomatic services where effectively other countries' diplomats would be providing those services. So it would make the process of travel easier. That can be done. For instance, in the U.S., they have a special. There's no Iranian embassy in Washington, but there's a special interest section I think it's the
It's a Pakistani
Pakistani embassy. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something worth exploring. I mean, I have no objection to. That's not the same as the reopening of diplomatic relations. And this is, I think, an important point to think about as well, is that yes, there can be workarounds that deal with the legitimate needs of people. I spoke with a gentleman earlier who was telling me that that his father, I think it was, who's in Iran, and there's issues with visiting back and forth. And this is an issue where special interest sections can definitely play a role.
Could you please announce your support for this session? Important, because most of the people here are for the same reason. Here for the same reason. If you announce your support for consulate services, it would be much appreciated.
So I am not in support of reopening diplomatic relations, but I have no problem with special interest sections.
So he's saying so. You do support consular services through special interest sections.
I have no objection to that.
I mean, and to be fair, ICC has always said. I mean, we value diplomatic ties as well, but we've always supported the opening of consular services as a first step towards a full resumption.
I was told by someone, by the way, and I can't verify this, but that the Iranians have not agreed to that option.
There are issues with that.
Okay.
We can talk about it later.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I believe some of the individuals in the Senate room. So, Kaveh, did you have your hand up before? Yeah. Go ahead.
Mr. Johnson, first of all, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your courage in introducing that motion. I know it's not easy. I come to you as somebody that was one of the organizers of the event that you spoke at in January. I come to you as somebody that lobbied Parliament before you joined for Parliament across all parties to recognize crimes against humanity committed in Iran, and to recognize September 1st as a day of commemorating political prisoners in Iran, and an event that a day of commemoration that the ICC refuses to recognize. So I think it takes great courage on your part to appear here. Thank you very much. On the petition point that was raised earlier, I just want to add a certain point, which is that I think it's really important to compare apples to apples. For the people that are actually signing petitions against the Islamic Republic, there's a great deal of fear that if their names are ever leaked, they themselves and their families would be in tremendous danger. They would end up in prison. So I think the idea of comparing these numbers is ridiculous. Now, my question to you, sir, you raised a really important point. You talked about the Iranian government investing a great deal in sort of front organizations, diaspora organizations that appear to speak for the community, but in fact are actually advancing the interests of the Islamic Republic. I want you to sort of, if you don't mind, explore that a little bit further and talk to us about what steps you think, as a parliamentarian, you can take to expose those organizations for what they are and to kind of remove their credibility.
Sorry, so one thing, a clarifying point you made on the petition. Petitions are anonymous in Canada. Official parliamentary petitions are anonymous in Canada. So that is a fact. That is a fact. But please, so the question. Sorry. So the question was. So I'm going to clarify the question again for Facebook Live. The question was, you mentioned something about front organizations for the government in Iran, and I believe his question was, how do you prevent or expose them?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, and this is a concern that I hear regularly from people in the Iranian community who feel that there is regime money that comes into Canada for various purposes, and there is also a fear about retaliation that could happen towards people's families, and it's not just a concern for the Iranian community, by the way. There are other repressive regimes around the world, and people may not be thinking about this if they come from if they were born in Canada, but there are many people from around the world whose political activity here in Canada could be tracked, and their family can face negative repercussions back home for what they do. So this is a big concern for us. On some level, it's a difficult thing for us to know exactly how to respond to, because some of these things happen outside of our country. But I think I'm keen on hearing suggestions from the community, from people that are affected by this, how we can respond when there's this issue of money coming from outside that are designed to shift our political debate, to give power to some organizations over others, and present a distorted view of how the community thinks. And I think there are some legislative tools that can do that as well, specifically tools around whether or not foreign governments can be funding certain kinds of activities in Canada. I think it's an area worth exploring for sure.
So just one question, so clarifying question, because this is a divisive point, and it's one that's been made before. Do we actually have any actual documented occasions of this actually happening in Canada? Or as far as I know, there are no organizations. As far as I know, that we're the only real advocacy organization for Iranian Canadians here, and we don't accept money from the Canadian or Iranian government from no governments. So my question to you is: do we actually have proof that this is occurring, or is this could be a kind of a tactic that's been used to delegitimize some voices over others? But really, do we actually have proof? Because I would like to know. Do we have proof of organizations like this existing, or money actually coming in, or is this kind of like, predictions?
Yeah, maybe the gentleman in the back knows of specific cases. This is something that I hear about a lot from the community. So it's something that I think is worth sharing from that perspective.
But you're not aware of any. I don't want to get into a back and forth where you're not aware of any.
Well, I'm not prepared to point fingers at specific organizations tonight. But I think that this is something that requires effective enforcement and further study because it's something that, again, I hear about regularly from people.
But we don't have any proof of that happening. So that's
at the moment.
This individual might, but otherwise we don't. Okay. This individual in the glasses. Sorry, with the short. Okay. Actually meant him, but you can talk afterwards. Mr. In the black. Yeah, that's you.
Yeah. Hi. I want to say two things. One is that just because there's been widespread protest doesn't mean people want the regime to change. It could be because they want the same regime to change its policies. And the second thing I want to say is that it seems to me that very often when a regime is replaced, there comes a period of disorder and possibly violence. Don't you think that if let's say, the current regime was replaced, in the possible, I think in the quite probable period of violence and disorder, there would be more serious human rights violations than the current violations under the current regime?
So I'm going to again repeat the question for Mr. Jennison and for our Facebook Live. First of all, you mentioned that there are some nuances. Basically, that's what you're saying, that the protests that are occurring in Iran are similar to protests that might happen in the United States against police violence or something like this. So actually, the idea is to actually change the policies of the existing government, and we shouldn't extrapolate that to mean that we want the destruction of government.
When did you make that statement?
That's why I'm confirming.
No,
Thank
you're
you.
not confirming.
Please let this individual
You're putting
speak.
words in people's mouths.
I'm not. If I am, he can say it himself. But go ahead.
Either exactly repeat. Sorry. Either exactly repeat the question or do not add your commentary.
It's about clarifying. It's about clarifying. That's why I'm asking him. I'm asking him. He can speak for himself. Go ahead.
What I meant was that you mentioned at least twice that you at least suggested that the majority of Iranians want the regime to change. And then you mentioned as evidence for that claim that there's been widespread protest in January and in 2008. I'm saying just because people are in the streets protesting doesn't mean they want the regime to change. It could just mean they want the regime to change its practices. The same regime to change its practices.
The idea is that they're asking for a policy change, not a regime change.
No, I understand the question. People in the streets could mean that if you didn't actually sort of study the slogans that are being chanted by the protesters, right? When you're chanting "death to the dictator," it's sort of hard to interpret that as a desire to see the dictator stay in place but change his policies. I think that's precisely the point. The comparison to anti-police violence protests in the United States is, with all due respect, a little bit much. The protests that exist in democratic countries exist in the context of people being allowed to protest, and they go out and express their point of view. That's different from a protest movement, which is fundamentally not allowed, where people are speaking out against the very structure of the regime, calling it to change, where they are stripping off the mandatory dress code and risking their lives in the process. Surely that is indicative of a much deeper kind of dissatisfaction than, we just want to get rid of the carbon tax or something, right? Clearly this is something more fundamental. And look, we don't have a scientific survey of the Iranian people either, but if you're going to offer me dueling petitions as the basis for opinion, then I will offer you massive protests where people are risking their lives as a strong indication of public opinion. Now, in terms of the question of disorder and violence happening in the context
maybe
of
we should actually, I should just repeat the question. So the question was whether regime change or basically, maybe, I mean, that term is loaded, but basically what Mr. Jennis might have been kind of advocating for, which is the revolution essentially within the country, or regime change in a sense, it would actually cause more disorder and more human rights violations and perhaps the deaths of innocent people. That's from what I understand what you were saying. So go ahead.
So I was in Ukraine a couple years ago, and I was inspired to walk in the places where Maidan protesters walked. I was actually led by a guy who was part of the Maidan protest. The Maidan was a protest movement that called for political change in Ukraine, and it was ultimately successful. People were killed in it, but it was an essentially non-violent protest movement that brought about political change in Ukraine, that brought about a return to a system that was more accountable, more democratic, etc. Yes, it can happen. Yes, it has happened. And yes, it will happen again. There are obviously counterexamples where a revolution has been followed by the ascendance to power of a similar or worse regime. But I believe that, first of all, the current regime in Iran is so repressive that it is worth pursuing change, that we shouldn't give in to a soft bigotry of low expectations and say, well, this is as good as it's going to get for the people of Iran. I don't believe that repressive theocracy is as good as it's going to get for the people of Iran. I believe that freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law, that is what the people of Iran deserve, and that's what they can have. And we should work with that goal in mind. And I just don't see a scenario, frankly, in which a worse regime would take over. I mean, by what criteria could a regime be dramatically worse?
To be fair, I mean, like, if we're really looking at the region, I think what most individuals here would say is that we look at Iraq, we look at Syria, we look at Libya. It's not even just not a worse regime, it's anarchy and death and civil war. I mean, to be fair, I mean, like, I think that's really what they're addressing. I mean, it's not necessarily between one regime and the other, it's between a regime and anarchy.
Yes.
I mean, and that's really the question.
So I think that there are dramatic political differences in terms of the facts on the ground in all of these cases. I mean, you
in Libya?
Well, so in Libya, I mean, the issue with Libya was you had a civil war, you had a kind of disorganized rebel army.
The same argument for that
go ahead.
Worse dictatorship, those kind of things, and you invaded, and now do you support that?
Sorry, what are you arguing against? So I advocated not.
So Mr. Jennis is not actually arguing for war. I think that's the point that you're trying to make.
Yeah.
What he would ask for is economic pressures and other pressures and diplomatic isolation. And that's really what he's asking for. We're gonna move on. I believe we have a lot of hands up. Okay, so Saman is on the board, and she is my sister, but she has had her hand up for a long time. I mean, I can't ignore it for long, but go ahead.
Hi, thank you for coming here today. So my background actually is in anthropology, so I have a master's in anthropology, and I spent the better part of the last 3 years researching, on the ground. I went to Iran, I spoke to people, and so my research really was on how sanctions have affected middle-class folks in Tehran specifically. And I keep in contact with a lot of my interlocutors that are really having a tough time. So, and, there are a few key kind of points I would like to highlight that my research has brought forth, and I consider myself kind of an expert on how the economic sanctions really affect folks. So there's the amount of precarity one feels when you're in Iran and you're middle class, and then you don't know how much money like your bank account has, because you never know what its value is the next day. And that precarity, and I want you to imagine your own bank account in that state of flux, is so dire that folks don't know if they can for instance, if $10 can afford them 5 slices of bread today, what that will mean tomorrow. And it's very difficult, I think, and we take it for granted how our dollar maintains the same value every day. But I want you to think about that for a second. On top of that, and so I spoke to a lot of people, and this kind of economic precarity and the amount of disdain they have for sanctions, and I was there when the JCPOA was agreed upon, and they were really excited for that, but it was also a time when it was right before Trump got elected. And I had, I think she was 10 years old, she was a daughter of an interlocutor, and she was like, do you really think that Trump is gonna get president? And at that time, no one thought that was gonna happen. And she said, well, I really like my room. I really like my stuff. Do you think he'll bomb us? Because I hear on the news, because they watch BBC, I hear on the news that if he comes back, they're gonna scrap the deal. And if a 10-year-old can kind of gauge that, economic sanctions aren't actually promoting peace, that economic sanctions actually are a different kind of violence that someone feels every day, the not being able to eat, the amount of precarity they feel every day, the fact that they're in near starvation, some folks are left homeless. For me, I don't see that as a non-violent way of trying to get at the end to meet the ends that you're proposing here, which is promotion of human rights, et cetera, et cetera. Because for me, human rights also does include the ability to afford your food, the ability to be able to afford housing, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you address that? Economic sanctions actually have proven to be actually quite violent and impede on individuals' human rights. So
the question is basically about the human costs of sanctions and how sanctions actually affect normal individuals. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I really appreciate hearing about your experience and your perspective. Do you mind if I just start by asking you a question, which is you're doing anthropological research inside of Iran. Do you think that if your research had come to a different conclusion, hypothetically, do you think you would have been able to stay and continue to do that research work in Iran?
I actually was in Iran when Homofar had gotten arrested, so I have so I was in a particularly precarious position, and I went to McGill, and so I'm colleagues with her technically because we're both in Montreal. Yeah. So and I've had conversations with her, and also my supervisor, very close, and again we come to this conclusion: for researchers to feel safe in a country, there needs to be diplomatic ties, as well as this kind of imprisonment for researchers, especially Iranian Canadian researchers, actually is beneficial to these more right-wing voices, extremist voices in Iran, and economic sanctions actually boisters.
Let's try to stick to that. So the question was about the human cost of sanctions. Maybe this is too much to bring in because we really don't have enough time. We have to move on. Sorry.
Yeah. So let me. There's always more to say than we can maybe say in the time that we have. But look, I mean, in terms of diplomatic relations, honestly, for researchers, though, I mean, there's currently cases, obviously, of Professor Kavasai Amami killed in prison at a time when we didn't have diplomatic relations, but then we also have the case of Kazemi who was killed at a time when we did have diplomatic relations. So, I mean, certainly whether we have diplomatic relations or not is not a guarantee of anybody's safety, especially given the human rights record in Iran. But to the issue of the cost of sanctions, look, as I said, I think we need to aim for the most aggressive and smartest sanctions we can, which means targeting specific human rights abusers, and which means sanctioning the IRGC and listing it as a terrorist entity under the criminal code. And I would love to hear what perspective people have specifically on the listing of the IRGC as a terrorist entity. I agree with you, though, that the economic situation is challenging for the people of Iran. And then it's just a question of, okay, to whom do you attribute that problem? After JPOA, when there was major sanctions relief, that sanctions relief was used not to benefit the people of Iran. It was used to further support violence and terrorism in the region. It's obviously in the interests of the regime to create a narrative that blames that blames economic problems on external powers as opposed to its own action. But the protest movement suggests that a large number of Iranian people don't buy into that narrative and understand precisely that it is the government's adventurism throughout the region that is leaving them vulnerable economically, because that's where the investment.
So sorry. So just to put some clarifying facts. So the sanctions were lifted for a very, very short amount of time. Many would argue that most foreign observers would also argue that the benefits of the economic benefits of sanctions, of lifting of sanctions, didn't actually reach Iran on either way. And she did make the point that the currency actually did stabilize because of the lifting of sanctions. So you can argue that there was real. I mean, we don't really have a lot of data on how that money was spent, or if that money, I mean, to be fair, like there isn't a lot of real data. A lot of that was based on. I mean, I understand that's your perspective and that's your opinion, but we have to remain factual. Is there a lot of data?
So if I can just respond to that, I look, the immediate impact of sanctions relief was some increased ability for the regime to sell oil, to access economic resources, and it continues and increases its support for the Assad regime.
Do we have actual data on that though?
On what point? That the Iranian regime is supporting Assad?
No, that it increased. That any of these activities actually increed. That's
well, I think so. I mean, what was it? 2015. Remind me of the date. 2015
when the JCPOA was signed.
Yeah. So 2015, and I mean, obviously, there's been an escalation in support for Hezbollah in the efforts to bring rockets. An escalation in support for the Assad regime. Yeah, I don't think any of that is.
I mean, if
there's clippings on
fair enough, if there's real data on that, I would like to see it. But I mean, a lot of this seems to be given wisdom that I haven't seen real data for. But fair enough. That's. I mean, and if you say that you have data on that, that's fair.
I mean, like if you look at Iranian activity in terms of support for the Assad regime, support for Hezbollah, and support for the Houthis, it has remained strong and grown over that period. The Houthis have been, to a greater extent, adopting Iranian regime tactics for persecution, for instance, against the Baha'is. They've been increasing missile activity. There's been a marked increase in activity and resources by all Iranian provinces.
I would actually love to, if you have actually that, I'd love to see it. I'm being completely honest, so that's fine. But let's move on. Okay, so this is, sorry, I said you were going to go next, and I forgot. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
His sister was more important.
As I told you, I have been a political prisoner in Iran. I have been tortured there. So in terms of human rights, if you hate Iran's regime, it's not more than me. I hate them more. I know them. But at the same time, I have an 88-year-old mom. I have a 90-year-old father. I am not allowed to go there and visit them because my political problems. They are not allowed to come here because, I don't know, because they're too old to go all around the world, knock the Canadian embassies to obtain a visa. There's no Canadian embassy there. You talked about the safety of the diplomats. You talked about the safety of the Canadian diplomats. Canada has an embassy in Afghanistan. How many diplomats have been killed in the last 200 years in Iran? No, nothing, zero. How many have been killed in Afghanistan in the last 20 years? You know, more than 20.
So, thanks for the question. I think first of all, my best wishes to your parents, and I think this is precisely why it's important for us to dig into that issue of the special interest section. I do not support the resumption of diplomatic relations, but I think there are ways of responding to that situation that, if there are no other barriers to your parents coming to Canada, that hopefully there are ways of making a visit from them possible. And by the way, I salute you for your courage as having been a political prisoner, and safety of diplomatic personnel, I mean, the issue with Iran is specifically that the current Islamic Republic, it's not a matter of the last 200 years, right? It's a matter of the specific current political configuration. Has, by all indications, used foreign diplomatic properties as a tool. And you know, yes, when you're in a place like Afghanistan where there is sort of generalized violence and volatility, you need to take the security situation very, very seriously and carefully. But arguably, that's at least a situation that you can control more than when you're in a country where you know, very likely there is a risk that under certain circumstances your embassy will be used not just by some, you know, rogue violent element, but by the regime itself as an intended target for violence. And I mean, we have seen this repeatedly in the history of the Islamic Republic. It's not some sort of idle hypothesis. It's something that we know has happened repeatedly, specifically in response to geopolitical quarrels between the Iranian regime and other countries.
Okay, so this lady and then Mr. Ahmadi and then Mr. Savastan.
First of all, thanks for coming here and attending this conversation. And I hope that this conversation will affect your opinion and be about your position. As a Canadian, I know the important concern of Canada is the human rights. And keeping open the embassy is exactly the human rights, following the human rights. You know, in the World War II, all the enemies kept open their embassy in the enemy country because they're following the human rights. Most of that concern you read from your letter are all concerned that immigrate to the other countries because we are educated, professional, wealthy, in a beautiful country. Because of that concern, we immigrate to the other countries. But you have to change your decision for keeping open the embassy. That concern that my homemade said about that, because it is the human right. It is the following the human rights that people can go and get the visa, take some thing that they need for trip in the other countries like Canada. I hope this conversation will affect your view of this, your decision.
Do you mind if I just ask you a question back? I mean, I understand the point you're making about the desire to be able to, you know, bring loved ones for a visit. Do you think a special interest section is a good alternative, given the concerns that I've raised? Is that a policy that achieves the objectives that all of us are seeking?
Yes, but okay. It is an internal issue. People of Iran has to work on that, not other countries. Other country has to open their embassy relationship, but maybe they have some sanction about the country that they don't like. It doesn't mean that you have to close your embassy in Iran.
Okay. Sorry, we're going to wrap this up along. So, Mr. Savastani, Mr. Ahmadi, Irfan, Mr. Sultanpur, for now, and then go ahead. So, Savastani.
Thank you for coming. I actually got two quick questions. One is about the motion itself. You're saying that you support the intersection, opening of an intersection, but the motion you propose bans any type of dialogue between the two countries whatsoever, period, right? So why didn't you leave that room in that motion, at least for the intersection? The second question I have, when it came to Iran, you said that moderates and fundamentalists are basically the same, different. When it came to Saudi Arabia, I guess correctly you mentioned that the current regime is better than the alternative. The alternative would be Al-Qaeda or whatever. And there's a third country in the Middle East where there is a good alternative, and that's the state of Israel. Political pressures on the state of Israel can actually cause a good change in that country. There is a good alternative there, right? Recently, there have been this recent law that rendering Israel as a Jewish state. Do you consider it as an improvement in human rights in Israel or a decline in human rights? Are you willing to take a motion to Canadian Congress condemning it? Or, because there is an alternative in the state of Israel, and that can work, that pressure can work. In case of Iran or Saudi Arabia, it may not work, but in Israel, it may actually work. I mean, international pressure may change things in the state.
I think you made your point. Okay, so that's good. Okay, so you have
Okay, so I guess 3 different specific points that I distilled out of that question. The motion, I don't have the text of it in front of me, and maybe I should have brought it.
I can read you relevant parts if you want to read.
Well, can I just look it so I can just reference it here? My recollection of it is that call on the government to abandon its current plan and immediately cease any and all negotiations or discussions with the Islamic Republic of Iran to restore diplomatic relations. I think that's fairly clear that it's about ceasing any and all negotiations or discussions to restore diplomatic relations. And the diplomatic relations is the issue. I think that's especially clear
discussions
given that
Council of Affairs.
Well, I don't have any objection to the opening of special interest sections. I just want to underline the second section, since it calls on the government to demand that the Iranian regime immediately release all Canadians and Canadian permanent residents.
Let's stick to that.
No. So it's fairly obvious in sub 2 that we still envision the government saying things to the government of Iran, just not having discussions about the reopening of diplomatic relations. Maybe just to put a finer point on what you said, what I said about so-called regime moderates and so-called regime hardliners, it's that, and this is well known, I mean, anybody that runs to be the president of Iran must be approved by the Supreme Leader, that the Supreme Leader holds all the cards. There is no institutional separation between different entities within the system. The system is all fully dominated and controlled by those who are positioned as the guardians of the revolution. So that is just to put a finer point on it. Look, in terms of Israel, I mean, the question of the nation-state law, I am not familiar with all the particulars of its provisions, but I will say this: I do not have a problem saying that Israel is a Jewish state. Israel is a state that was designed, I think, legitimately as a homeland for the Jewish people. That does not obviate of obligations towards minority communities, and as is well known, there are Israel is one of, if not the only countries in the Middle East where Muslims are able to vote in free and fair democratic elections. They enjoy representation in the Knesset.
Because I know there are Muslims in Congress, in Israeli parliament.
Yeah.
Do you think after this new law?
I believe Mr. Jenna said that he's not aware of the particulars of the law, but you should know that a lot of observers. So
they can't vote. The Muslim people can't vote in settlement.
Yeah, so there are certain, but I don't think you were prepared to answer this question. So let's move on.
But I'm happy to respond to the, because I think, look, it's an important question. So Arab, Muslim, anyone else who is an Israeli citizen is able to vote in an Israeli election.
The question is in occupied areas. Well, let's
people who are in the West Bank and Gaza, in areas A, B, and C, they ideally would be able to vote in Palestinian elections. And I am a big supporter of a two-state solution, and the Oslo framework in involves a Palestinian Authority, which
Sorry, we're gonna
exists. This is important. Just let me finish this very quickly. But there have not been democratic elections in the Palestinian territories for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I really want to get away from Palestine.
So if people are concerned about not being able to
vote, we can continue these conversations later. We have a limited amount of time in the room, so let's get away from that. So Mr. Ahmedi, then Irfan, then Mr. Sultanpur, and then yes.
So thanks for being here and for accepting ICC's invitation. Just one thing, first of all, I'm amazed at how a member of parliament talks without actually presenting any piece of evidence or facts. And you talk a lot of what you mentioned is not based on facts or evidence, it's actually your assumptions. And even when Puyan actually asks you for evidence, numbers, and data, you cannot provide it. So it's amazing that a member of parliament actually presents his points without evidence. So I actually decided, instead of asking you a question, to fact check on a couple of things that you mentioned, and then if you want, please respond. Safety and security concerns for Canadian diplomats. A report was actually accessed by actually CBC, and they published a report about the safety security assessment report that was done by government agencies in November of 2014. And I read a part of this report. The report completed less than 9 months before the Conservative government shut down the embassy and ordered Iranian diplomats out of Canada. Said the biggest threat at the time was from a natural disaster. And it continues to say the high risk of catastrophic earthquake remains the most significant safety and security challenge. So there was no security threat posed to Iranian diplomats at the time that the previous government that you support as a conservative decided to close down the embassy based on that. With respect to consular services, Mr. Savastan mentioned a very good point that the attempts of the Conservative Party as the official opposition in the parliament is actually causing for the negotiations between Canada and Iran, even before this motion, not to move forward. We are all aware, publicly in media, officials both from the government of Iran and the government of Canada said repeatedly that the negotiations, the point of the negotiations that started from time of Prime Minister Trudeau was at the first step to open consular services for especially Iranian Canadians here and for any Canadian citizen that travels to Iran. However, there are a couple of things. One are the attempts of your conservative government that is trying to block your conservative party that is trying to block this, and the other thing is the law that the conservative government of Prime Minister Harper passed, which is Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act, and confiscation of properties of Iran in Canada. That piece of legislation that you guys passed, maybe you weren't at the time there. If you don't support it, please say it so. But that piece of legislation is the main barrier for any resumption of any type of relations, whether it's only for consular services or otherwise. And these are facts that have been stated in media. It's not only that I'm actually reading this. With respect to corrupt money that is in Canada, that Mr. Shahruz referred to, in 2011, Mr. Khavari, which was a banker in Iran, fled to Canada, and your government, the conservative government of Prime Minister Harper, did absolutely nothing about it. Iranian Canadians signed petitions for him to be deported back to Iran. They signed petitions for at least the government of Harper to do an investigation. He did not even acknowledge whether they did an investigation about him or not, or if there were basis for them to actually confiscate the money that he embezzled from Iranian people. With regards to JCPOA, Iran followed with its obligations, sir. And the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, they all confirmed, all the other parties to the nuclear agreement, they all confirmed that Iran followed its obligations. With respect to sanctions on Iranian people, one of the benefits of it was that Iran could be able to, or would be able to renew its fleet of the airliners, of the passenger airliners. They purchased 200 airplanes, commercial airplanes. Only 20 of them was delivered before Trump decided to reimpose the sanctions. So when you talk about sanctions and the impact that it had or it could have on Iranian lives and Iranian people, think about these issues, please, as well. And my last point is a reminder for you, sir. It's you're a member of parliament in Canada. Your mandate, your authority, and jurisdiction is with regards to your writing and the politics in Canada. Definitely human rights with universal values that we all believe in, and I appreciate that you talk about human rights. However, for you to come and suggest and advocate for regime change in another country that you have absolutely no jurisdiction about, that you absolutely have no mandate even from your voters in your writing, is, to my basically belief, is ridiculous. And you're completely out of your league and out of your jurisdiction when you suggest that. Your opening speech completely reminds me of remarks and speeches that I heard from, for example, Netanyahu when he went and testified in front of the Senate in the US, in the Congress, and he suggested that if we liberate Iraq, then the whole Middle East will become democratic and they will respect democracy. At that time, he was not prime minister, he was a government official. We saw what happened in Iraq. You even refused to admit that Iraq was not about democratizing the country, it was about the weapons of mass destruction. We saw what happened in Afghanistan, we saw what happened in Libya, and those countries are way more closer in the same region as Iran is, instead of you comparing Iran to another country. Also, I don't think Ukraine is a great example to bring up with what's happening in east of Ukraine right now, and Crimea, and that that whole region right now is in kind of civil war still. Thank you.
Just one thing on the airliners issue. What he's referencing there is that there have been consistent crashes in the Iranian domestic flights, especially, and many observers think that on the aging fleet that has been aging because of sanctions, and many of those sanctions actually apply directly towards replacement parts for airliners. But please go ahead.
Thank you for your question, and I think, frankly, it's quite revealing, actually. I mean, I'm going to do my best to respond to all of them, but first of all, you know, the way you started kind of attacking me in terms of my approach. Let me just say this. I am glad we live in a country where you have the freedom to do that. Because if you talk to a politician in Iran the way you talk to me, of course, you wouldn't have much freedom. But I'm glad you have the freedom to do that. And I think that's
let's try to the issue that he raised. I mean, many people are very angry. Sorry, everybody, please give get some respect.
In terms of the security of the embassy, look, I was in the Middle East when Saudi Arabia executed Nimr al-Nimr, who is a prominent Shia cleric, which was a terrible thing to do, obviously. And the response inside Iran was a organized protest and setting fire to the Saudi embassy in response to a decision of the Saudi government, which was a violation of human rights, but it spoke to the way in which the Iranian regime uses diplomatic properties. I think that's clear. It's not some sort of idle speculation that I've put together. This is the history of the Islamic Republic. This is a repeated pattern of its behavior. In terms of the Justice for Victims of Terror Act, this is legislation that allows people that are victims of violence to seek financial recompense. I think it's just, I think it's moral, I think it's right, and I support it. You know, in terms of the particular case of the banker you highlighted, I'm sorry, I don't have the particulars of that case in front of me, and there may be aspects of the government's response that are classified. I don't know, but that may be a reason why, from your perspective, there was a lack of communications around the particulars of the case. JCPOA. So, just to be precise about the point I made about JCPOA, I did not speak in my remarks one way or the other to the issue of nuclear compliance. That's a contested point, but
so I would agree it's not contested. The IEA has
a contested point in my judgment, and clearly others don't disagree. But contested means
not by the IEA. That's not what you're saying. Not by the IEA.
No, I mean I think evidence has been presented that suggests that Iran was not in compliance, and others.
Not from the IEA.
That was not a point that I addressed in my remarks. The point that I spoke about with respect to JCPOA was that sanctions relief has been followed by Iran taking I would argue, more aggressive, indisputably a very aggressive posture in the region towards other countries. Sanctions relief was not a tool to reinvest back in the improvements in the Iranian economy. And when Iranian protesters have slogans with them, things like, not Gaza, not Lebanon, not Syria, my life for Iran, I think they understand the problem, which is that they have a regime that is using any and all available resources to invest in spreading its revolutionary ideology as opposed to improving the lives of people there.
So the question was about airliners.
On the issue of Ukraine that you raised, Ukraine shows that it's bad when Russia invades you, but that I don't think should be read as sort of a fundamental problem of the Maidan movement or of those who are seeking a better life, a more democratic life for themselves in Ukraine. I mean, that does seem like sort of victim blaming at its worst when you suggest that somehow that's not a good example to the point that I was presenting. On the issue of the airliners, I mean, look, there are obviously issues associated with potential diversion of things that are sold to the Iranians, to the Iranian regime. So I think, I think that when you're talking about selling aircraft to a regime that repeatedly uses whatever tools it has at its disposal to spread violence throughout the region, I think those are questions we should explore seriously in terms of the risks of diversion.
So you're saying commercial airliners parts or sales would be used by the military?
Well,
is that
and
what
war
you're...
equipment to Arabistan not?
Pardon me?
And war equipment.
Well, let's no, I really no. Let's not.
Well,
I'm not jumping on you. I'm actually asking a question. So that is what
so
you're saying.
I think the existing sanctions regime is one that needs to be preserved. I think in addition to the listing of the IRGC, I'm not an expert on the technical aspects of airline parts, but I would say that we need a strong system of sanctions, and I'm open to proposals to smarten those sanctions.
I mean, so you would be open to the possibility of removing civilian airline aircraft?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I think.
But then I think you have to answer the question, which is that is seen as harming the Iranian people. So very clearly, and that's.
Well, look. Let's be clear that sanctions should be as targeted as possible, but they are never going to be perfect in terms of how targeted they are. Right? I mean, I favor sanctioning the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as I've discussed. Obviously, there are probably some people that might be employed by IRGC-owned companies who are not themselves involved in any of the violence or simply working for a company that the military owns that might be negatively affected by the sanctions. We understand that, but if the goal is to put the kind of pressure that can bring about political change, then we have to look not only at the costs of action, but the costs of inaction.
At the end, was it the...
Sorry, let's stick to that because there are a lot of people in line. Sorry about that, but a lot of people in line. So I believe I have Mr. Sultanpur, then Irfan, and then Ms. Hadi. Sorry, I have you, and then Ms. Hadi. I'm sorry, what was your name? Can I just get your name? Matt. And then Khanum Mahnaz, and then Ms. Hadi. So Sultanpur, Irfan, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Mr.
First of all, thank you for attending the event. Because our MP, who is Iranian descent, in last year, he has never been able to attend any Iranian or any town hall meeting. So it is very great that is one of the Canadian politicians attending and listening to the Iranian community at the open house. So, but the same, when you very power, conservative, then the same. You shut down the embassy, and after 6 weeks, Mr. Harper selected 7 people to say that, okay, we did this one for the Iranian community. So in at least from 2012, the Iranian community are out of any connection with the government, liberal or conservative. So it is not Canadian democracy. I learned democracy in Canada. So this is not the same way that is Canadian democracy. It is Canadian democracy. They have to first discuss with the Iranian community in an open hall meeting, so which never happened. First of all. Second of all, Canada has the biggest foreign minister in G7, or even the board. We have 8 foreign ministers in 12 years. 6 in Harper time and 2 in liberal government, which we know that Dion has a 12, and
We're sorry, if you could hurry up, we don't have that much time.
It is very important. So, so the point is that you guys, all Canadian politicians, they have never had a clue on Middle East. Simple as it is. Most of you guys, except that you gone to the Israel with a parliamentary group, most you have not been in any other country, in any country in the Middle East. Am I correct?
No, that's not true actually. So I've been to the UAE, I've been to Israel, and I also went on a parliamentary friendship group with the Palestinian parliamentary friendship group. I spent a week in the West Bank.
You have not been in Turkey, you have not been in Iran.
I actually have been in Turkey, yes. I haven't spent a lot of time in Turkey, but I have been in Turkey. Yes.
Major of your sources are MEK, which I was a member of that one. I am wondering, Mr. Harvey going to MEK, we have never in the last 50 years had any election. What is the Canadian democracy or value you see Harper or conservative seeing in the MEK? It is very great. Even they cannot talk to they cannot get married. So what is the point? In Canada against the Canadian value. So I go very fast. In January 2012, Erwin Cutler and John Baird in Tel Aviv, they announced a new sanction against Iran, extraordinary of the United Nations. It is very symbolic and very political. On March, Netanyahu came to Canada. It happened on September, they shut down the embassy. In May, Jason Kennedy told us we are going to have town hall meeting. It is almost 6 years, they never held it. So the whole issue is that this kind of, it is not human rights, the basic. The basic is political, coming from the Netanyahu lobby, made in Israel. It is not Canadian made, because mostly 20% of Canadians support Israel in Canada. Mostly they don't care about the...
please.
So I appreciate your stand, but the point is that everything coming from the Netanyahu lobby, and even, that's it, you are not...
I think that was more of a comment.
You are doing this one, but you have less knowledge, and the point is that whenever that you stand...
So we have to wrap up in like 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to stop you. Okay, so go ahead, answer the question.
Whenever that you stand against the...
Please, okay, please, could we please? Mr. Jennings is going to answer. We have lots of people that want to ask questions, so please go ahead.
So there was a lot there. I heard someone suggest I visit Iran over here in the middle of that question, and I'm not sure how warm a reception I would receive there. But after we successfully can bring about political change in Iran, I look forward to visiting a free Iran, and hopefully I'll be able to do that very, very soon. I have to say, sir, like with all due respect to your point, it is troubling when I hear people kind of use this argument that, you know, the Israeli lobbyists are behind everything. I mean, again, with all due respect, I mean, there was some subtle anti-Semitism in the presumption that, you know, the Jews are behind it all, right? And I think, you know, we are responding to what many in the Iranian community are saying, and differing perhaps with those in this room. Okay, there's only one Jewish state in the world, right? So,
but that's fair. He answered the question. Please, sorry, we got to move on. We really have to move on. So Irfan and then Mahmoud. Irfan, please go ahead. Sorry.
Let this guy ask the question. I think he wants. Sir, go ahead, stand up and ask the question. I don't hear what you have to say.
They've been waiting for a long time. Sorry. If you can talk to Mr. Jennings afterwards, Irfan, and then Mr. Mahmoud. Okay, please. Sorry, we will. I mean, hopefully you have a little bit of time.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah.
I was thinking, what if, say, years down the road, Iran want to make good relation with Canada, and they are asking some retaliation requests about the human rights in Canada, or say they want Canada to suspend the weapon deals with Saudi Arabia, or what if, say, Saudi Arabia respond to Canada for more relation with Canada, they want some influence in Canada, and they're asking say some changes in what we see in Quebec, they limit the freedom of the women dress or something.
Yeah.
Say they want something like this, what your response would be to them?
Yeah. So.
If they tie any further relation
so I believe
some precondition like these changes in our country.
Yeah, Irfan, so basically your question is that what if Iran starts making demands for certain human rights changes or policy changes in Canada in return for diplomatic relations?
Yeah, just to not be ridiculous. In Middle East standard comparing to the Canada standard. I know that these are different. Just not to be ridiculous.
So your point is, what if Iran started asking for policy changes in the internal politics of Canada? I believe that's what you're trying to say.
So thank you for the question. It reminds me of a point that this gentleman made that I didn't address. This question of the internal spheres of some countries versus all. I think as a country we should be open to having dialogue with other countries about our own human rights record and theirs. I think we have a strong case to be made that Canada is a leader in the world in terms of human rights, and I think where there are questions that are posed, we can answer those questions. In terms of the issue of being able to wear religious symbols in Quebec, obviously that's a question that deals with a provincial law, but it also raises questions about constitutional issues. So, if Iran wanted to ask Canada about that, it'd be easy to point out to the issue of separation of powers. Sometimes when I'm talking about human rights internationally, people ask questions about the situation of Indigenous people in Canada. And of course we know, I think all of us know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But at the same time, I don't think you can compare a situation in Canada that we know is a problem and that everybody across the political spectrum is seized with trying to respond to in a way that is genuinely meeting the needs of people in that situation versus, a reality in other countries. In Iran, just to choose one example, consensual same-sex sexual activity is punishable by death. That's obviously on a level much further down than in terms of human rights than whatever legitimate challenges exist in Western countries. So shouldn't we be open to a conversation about our human rights record and other people's human rights record? Absolutely. But I don't think anyone should buy into some kind of false equivalence between some of the challenges we have and the problems of intention and action and active repression that exist in other places.
Fair enough. And I think you did recognize that there was a standard, that there were different standards, but okay. Ms. Mahnouz and Ms. Hadi, go ahead.
I just would like to know that how do you explain Saudi Arabia behavior against Canada's complaint to this country for the human rights that they made recently? They just closed the embassy of Canada in Saudi Arabia. They let all the members go. So isn't this kind of similar behavior that Canada did against Iran in different ways? So they just closed the door for any dialogue as soon as they see something against what they believe?
No, I don't think it's the same. I think it's a world of difference. The official Saudi story, and I wonder, obviously what things may have been going on behind the scenes that those of us in the opposition and you and the general public are not privy to. But the official explanation ostensibly is that one tweet calling for the release of a political prisoner was the basis for shutting off all diplomatic relations. That's very different from. I think I outlined many of the reasons why we felt that closing the embassy was the right approach. And you can disagree with those, but I don't think there's anything like an equivalence between these.
No, my point is closing the door for dialogue doesn't ever fix anything in either side.
Well, I think this is an important point that official diplomatic relations provide automatic access of one country to the other. closing off official diplomatic relations does not exclude the possibility of back-channel conversations. But it is a strong signal about our extreme level of displeasure for the of concern about the actions of the country in question. So, do I think it is appropriate in certain circumstances? Yes, yes, I do.
So, I think there's a clarification that needs to be made here. So, you're saying that you are in favor of dialogue with Iran as long as it's not formal. Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I said. But what I said is that there are opportunities for back channels that exist outside of diplomatic relations. I mean, again, I'll refer you back to the motion, which rejects the reopening of diplomatic relations, and it also calls for us to say specific things to Iran.
So saying the motion does presuppose some kind of dialogue.
Well, it presupposes us saying things to the Iranians.
So some kind of dialogue.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, but not directly, perhaps.
But it is explicitly against the reopening of diplomatic.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. I had Ms. Hadi, and I believe.
Hello. Thank you for being here. First of all, I have a question that has Canada or any party or the party that suggested the motion, any mechanism, any strategy has been in place or being designed to prevent people from the regime coming here with the money, like Hawaii is another one example, but being many big numbers that we can hear every day coming to Canada. And if any changes happen in Iran, whether the regime change or policy change or whatever, I think we all agree that that number will go high. Is there, in support of people of Iran, has there any mechanism being thought of to prevent these people getting here? Has been any consultation with the organization who are working on documentation, human rights documentation of Iran, the names or the documents or any system that can actually prevent that? That's my question. And the other thing is that the survey that you were talking, is that the survey that it was sent yesterday?
Yeah, it was sent by email, that's correct. Yeah.
So the survey was sent yesterday asking if you agree or disagree with the motion, was sent yesterday and was resent today, and to the community, not just the members.
I mean, I believe it was sent to our,
Not just
to our
the
list,
current
that's correct.
members.
It was sent to our list, that's correct.
Sure. So I think as an org, we don't have any scientific number or I haven't seen any word from ICC even at the time of the petition with 16,000. The petition was signed for people who, as we see.
So we don't have that much time, but I'm going to answer your question directly about ICC.
My question,
Yeah,
let me finish. Yeah. The people want the consulate.
We have to go. Sorry, so I'm going to answer your question.
No, I have to finish.
We're going to get kicked out. All right, fine, go ahead.
I was prepared for 1 minute, but if it can go for others, it has to go for me too. So I suggest to this organization that is claiming the only advocacy, Iranian Canadian advocacy organization, to do a more scientific number gathering of what the community really thinks, and for those problems, which is like one of them that still can look like it's doable, the consulate services doing something for there, and if you have any idea what's the numbers.
So this is not about ICC, but I will tell you, and I've said this already. We would love to do scientific polling. It is an extremely expensive endeavor, and I wish that we were able to do that.
You can call for sponsors.
We do it.
I will work voluntarily for you.
Please, if you're willing to fundraise specifically for a scientific survey, I would love that. Please, thank you so much.
If you don't
so please go ahead and answer the question that she asked.
Sure. So I'll address the 2 points and try to do as quickly as possible. I know because of time. In terms of people coming here with regime money, this is an issue that I hear about regularly. And as an opposition MP, we have limited resources. I mean, we have an opportunity to put forward private members' bills, but they're generally very limited in scope, and actually the rules exclude them from involving any expenditure of money. So it's hard to do anything all that dramatic in government without spending money. So as an opposition MP, I'm not aware of particulars of what the government is doing in this respect. respect. But I agree with you that it's important to look at this issue of money coming from abroad that's trying to influence Canadian politics. One of the areas where we look at this, by the way, is foreign money influencing Canadian elections. And we've been critical of the government in terms of how their new elections bill does not, in our judgment, do enough to prevent foreign money influencing Canadian elections.
Sorry, I just want to emphasize, I'm not just talking, because that was mentioned in another question, not just influencing Canadian politics. My concern is this money belongs to that country.
Yes.
And I want that country and that people who have gone through that sanctions, that we think that it's like the sanction is responsible for that all the people is going through. It's not that. It's the money that is coming out. And I want to make sure, I want to hear it for you, that having that human rights issue, not that Canada is standing up for the values. That's one of the things. This money belongs to those people and shouldn't be coming so easy. And people are coming and living here legally.
I believe that Mr. Dennis answered that one in regards to the question about Mr. Khabari. We really have to go.
I really appreciate the point, and it's something that I know we need to dig in further. Just on the polling, I don't want to be overly pedantic about scientific surveying. I get that not every community organization has the capacity to do scientific surveying, but it is an important point when we talk about the aggregation of opinion. I have an email list. If I email my email list saying, do you think Garnett is a great guy? Yes or no? I'm going to get a lot of people that will say yes because they're on my email list. If they don't like me, they're probably not on my email list, right? It's the same with any organization that is surveying their own email list about whether or not people agree with their perspective on a particular issue. It's pretty natural that you get positive agreement with your positions on your email list. That's not a criticism of anybody. That's just
and to be fair, I prefaced that survey with that I said that there are stakeholders, people that do agree with us. But again, to just display some facts, is that NIAC in the United States actually did pay a scientific surveying organization to undertake some surveys of the Iranian American population, and they found that many did support the lifting of sanctions, no war with Iran, and an opening of embassies. However you want to take that. This is an Iranian.
I don't support war with Iran either.
No. I'm just saying. For example, we do have some indication, but that's fair. Okay, we really have to wrap up. I'm sorry. I believe that they're outside trying to kick us out. Thank you so much.
If you guys do want to have scientific polling, we have a donation box. We would love to.
But you have to step aside from that.
That's why it's scientific polling. Okay, please, let's up. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.